How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? Toy Dueler here, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the timeline in the Pokemon games. The timeline of the Pokemon games can be very confusing. It's almost as confusing as the timeline in The Legend of Zelda, and boy, we all know that's insane. One of the writers of the Pokemon games, and be warned I'm about to butcher his name, Toshinibu Matsusumiya, tweeted out an official timeline of the Pokemon games, stating that the official timeline is this: Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green happened at the same time as Ruby and Sapphire, followed by Heart Gold and Soul Silver happening at the same time as Diamond and Pearl, and then come Black and White, followed by Black and White 2, which happened at the same time as Pokemon X and Y. So there we go, case closed, that's the official timeline, right? Wrong. There are a few things that don't add up. First off, where are the original games? This doesn't include all the games. I don't see any Pokemon Red, Blue, Green, Yellow, Gold, Silver, Crystal, any of those. And second, if Pokemon X and Y are in the same timeline as all the other Pokemon games, how come there's no Fairy type in the other Pokemon games? Or how come there's no Mega Evolution? Now, of course there's no Mega Evolution and Fairy type in those games because they weren't invented at the time yet, but speaking for continuity, if all of these games are in the same timeline, they should all have the same types and they all should include Mega Evolution. But anyway, this was the official timeline and there was nothing we really could do to debate it until Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came out and shook everything up. In the Delta episode of Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you meet this weird girl called Zinnia. Part of the Delta episode plotline is that a meteor is going to crash into Hoenn and destroy the whole region. Instead of letting Hoenn get destroyed, scientists came up with a way to teleport the meteor to another dimension. Zinnia doesn't want to let that happen because she believes sending it to the other world could destroy it because they wouldn't have the technology to deal with it. She comes outright and says there's another Hoenn region out there just like this one but without Mega Evolution. So she's definitely referencing the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald games. So if she's referencing that in a Pokemon game and saying that it's just like this one but not exactly the same, then that creates two different timelines. One with Mega Evolution and one without Mega Evolution. Now we could just ignore what Zinnia says and call her crazy because she does do quite a few questionable things in the Delta episode. Or we could also look at this as her outright saying that there's another dimension out there in a world that does not have Mega Evolution, and that would make perfect sense for our two-timeline theory. So what is this two-timeline theory that I keep referencing? So basically there would be two timelines. The first one I'll call the dual slot timeline, in reference to the Nintendo DS and how it can play both Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS games, which would include every game that's in this timeline. It would start off with Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green happening at the same time as Pokemon Emerald. Red would start his journey in the Kanto region, collect the 8 Kanto badges, defeat Team Rocket, and become the champion of the Indigo League. Meanwhile in Hoenn, Brendan would start his journey, collect the 8 badges, defeat Team Aqua and Magma, and become the champion of the Hoenn region. We know these games happen at the same time because they're able to communicate with each other and trade and battle without any issues. Then, 3 years later, Heart Gold and Soul Silver and Pokemon Platinum would all start up. Ethan starts his journey in the Johto region, collects the 8 Johto badges, and defeats Team Rocket once more. And we know that this happens 3 years later because many members of Team Rocket mention that this is 3 years after Red originally defeated them in the Kanto region. After Ethan becomes the Johto champion, he travels to Kanto and collects the 8 badges there and eventually battles Red on Mount Silver. Meanwhile in Pokemon Platinum, Lucas starts his journey, collects the 8 Sinnoh badges, and defeats Team Galactic, becoming the Sinnoh champion. Then, after an unknown amount of time, I'm gonna go with around 6 years, Pokemon Black and White take place. Herbert starts his adventure in the Unova region, and collects the 8 badges, and defeats Team Plasma, becoming the Pokemon League champion. 2 years later, the last games in this timeline take place, Pokemon Black 2 and Pokemon White 2. Nate starts his journey in the Unova region and defeats all the 8 gym leaders, collects the 8 badges and defeats Team Plasma, and goes on to become the Pokemon League champion. He then goes to the Pokemon World Tournament where he meets all the gym leaders and champions from the other regions. This is a perfect little ending to our timeline because it just makes perfect sense. The Pokemon World Tournament has the best trainers in all the lands, and it only includes trainers and the champions from the regions in this timeline. Now you're probably wondering why I didn't include the first versions of the game, like Pokemon Diamond and Pearl and Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. This is because generally the third version is considered the perfected version and is canon over the original versions. The second timeline I'm going to call the Mega Timeline. This timeline starts off with Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, with Brendan once again our protagonist. Depending on which game you're playing, he battles Team Aqua or Team Magma, defeats them, collects the 8 Hoenn gym badges, and becomes the champion of the Hoenn region. We know that these games take place before Pokemon X and Y because in Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, you can see Mr. Bonding become created. Then, after an unknown amount of time, but it probably can't be that long at all because these games are able to trade with each other, Pokemon X and Y start. Callum is the protagonist of Pokemon X and Y, and he travels through the Kalos region, collecting the 8 badges, defeats Team Flare, and becomes the champion just like all the people in the other regions. And that's the current end of the Mega Timeline. All new Pokemon games will go in this timeline because they'll have Mega Evolutions and Fairy type, and we know that the other regions also exist in this timeline because many characters in both Pokemon X and Y and Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire mention other regions. It's assumed that basically the same things that happened in the dual slot timeline will happen in this timeline, except a little bit different with Mega Evolutions and Fairy types. And that's it, those are the 2 Pokemon timelines. But wait, what about Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Crystal? Those 2 actually start a 3rd timeline called the Original Timeline. Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Crystal exist in their own timeline because they don't connect with any of the newer Pokemon games, so they can't fit in the dual slot timeline, and they don't fit in the Mega Timeline because they just don't have Mega Evolutions. And there we have it, the 3 Pokemon timelines. The Original Timeline, the Dual Slot Timeline, and the Mega Timeline. I hope you guys enjoyed my video on the Pokemon timelines, and if you did, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more awesome Pokemon videos like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you guys next time.